So look, in terms of the overview of the big themes, Mark has really covered that very extensively. I just point out something that's probably quite obvious, and that is that context is very, very important for the COP, right? So the COP in one sense is, of course, an implementation type tool for the international climate regime. And in many ways, this COP is expected and has always been expected to be a so-called implementation COP. Glasgow was, a big milestone in terms of political commitments, now getting down to some of the nitty-gritty, right? But on the other hand, a COP is always an opportunity to set direction and reconfirm prior commitments and so forth. And so the overall situation is, of course, a dramatically different one from last year's because of Russia's war on Ukraine and the energy crisis and everything that flows from that. And the cold winds that are blowing geopolitically between China and the US as well. Okay, so what do we got? We've got an energy crisis, and most governments of countries that are not that are not fossil fuel exporters have as an absolute priority for them dealing with the high energy prices, right? And so that's very much foremost of mind. That places enormous short-term strains on governments' budgets, and that bodes really quite badly for climate finance, when we understand climate finance, as we do in the UN negotiations, to mean transfers from rich countries to poorer countries for climate action, right? So I think it's fair to expect that will be an even more difficult topic this time around. And, the COP is in Africa, and so the focus will be very rightfully on the needs of poorer countries, of countries with rapidly growing populations, and with countries that are heavily exposed to climate change impacts, right? And on the other hand, it's very difficult to see developed countries making further commitments to providing climate finance in this context. And in fact, it's very difficult to see developed countries, by and large, to make convincing reassurances about keeping earlier commitments, right, at this juncture. What's happening with energy? Well, Europe is backfilling for Russian gas, right? That means a short-term greater reliance on coal, right? Imported LNG as well as nuclear. Now, we heard this already in the G20 context, right? Some of the fossil fuel producing, developing and industrializing countries are using this as an argument to slow down progress on climate change action overall, pointing to Germany, for example, saying, look, Germany's keeping coal-fired power stations open for longer than they said. The priority in this world is to expand fossil fuel supply. So expect to hear some of that at COP, and that, of course, goes exactly against the overall established direction. Medium to longer term, however, it is now clear, I think it's fair to say, it's now clear that the energy crisis is leading to a great acceleration of investment in renewable energy and clean energy and in industry overall. Okay. Why is that? Well, because, for most countries, energy security means domestic production of energy. And for the non-fossil fuel rich countries, that by and large means renewable energy. Okay. So we're seeing a massive push into renewable energy in Europe in particular, right? Not just renewable energy, but heat pumps and other energy saving technologies and electrification. And we're seeing a massive push into clean energy and industry in the US as well, essentially for industry policy reasons and economic positioning of the US economy with the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're seeing similar moves in East Asia as well. And so that's extremely positive, right? So that in itself will significantly reduce emissions below a trajectory that you would have otherwise expected. And it will make it cheaper for other countries to adopt those technologies, will make it cheaper for developing countries as well. On the geostrategy, look, a greater focus on national security and the like will generally mean less emphasis on UN and multilateral institutions, I'd say. On the other hand, and I'm really interested to hear Jackie's take on this as well, is it might open the avenues for so-called climate clubs more widely, right? So associations of like-minded countries that are pushing the same direction. The G7 resolution has quite prominently the creation of a G7 climate club of countries with great ambition on climate change that is actually open to non-G7 countries. What else? Yep, climate finance, big, of course. Global stocktake, important one to watch. Hasn't really received a lot of attention, but you'll see, there's preliminary reports of the global stocktake on progress towards emissions reductions, right? And so I think that deserves more exposure. Finally, to say, I'll end on this, the expectation was that by this time, all countries that had not updated their nationally determined contributions, their NDC 2030 targets, would have done so. Only a few countries have, so there's still a lot to come. It's kind of an open question, I think, as to whether and when countries will indeed strengthen their 2030 targets, those countries that haven't already. And Australia is, of course, among a relatively small number of countries that between Glasgow and this year's COP have indeed strengthened their domestic commitment, and expect the Australian government to make a lot of that fact.